After nearly 15 years on death row, Betty Lou Beets was led into the execution chamber on February 24, 2000. She was 62 years old, a mother of 5, a grandmother of 9, a great-grandmother of 6. She looked like any other woman you might see at a church picnic or a grocery store checkout line. But Betty wasn't here for being a loving grandmother. She was here because the state of Texas branded her a murderer, cold-blooded, calculated, and unrepentant. Only the second woman executed in Texas since the Civil War. As the straps tightened across her frail arms, the weight of her past hung heavy in the room. When the warden asked if she had any last words, Betty stayed silent. No apologies, no explanations, just a faint smile toward her lawyer and pastor before closing her eyes. 2 coughs, 1 sharp breath, then nothing. Her final meal was ordinary: a T-bone steak, fried potatoes, bread, a salad, and peach cobbler. But nothing about the crimes that put her here was ordinary, because in 1983, when her 5th husband, Jimmy Don Beets, vanished, neighbors prayed he had simply walked away. Instead, police dug beneath the decorative wishing well in Betty's yard and uncovered his body, hidden beneath stone and soil. And when investigators searched further, the nightmare deepened. Another body, another husband. Her 4th, David Wayne Smith, buried under the garage, just steps from the kitchen window. A grandmother's yard turned into a graveyard, a wishing well filled not with coins and dreams, but with bones. For prosecutors, Betty was a predator, a black widow who killed for money, collecting life insurance, cashing pension checks, and playing the grieving widow. For supporters, she was a shattered soul, a woman scarred by decades of abuse, finally crushed by a justice system that showed no mercy. So what was she? A manipulative killer who fooled police, neighbors, and her own family for years? Or a broken woman who became as violent as the men who hurt her? Her silence at the moment of death gave no answers. And so, decades later, her story still burns with questions about love, power, money, and survival. But to understand how Betty Lou Beets became one of the most infamous women ever executed in America, we need to go back. Back to her childhood in North Carolina. Back to a half-deaf girl, neglected and scarred. And then forward to a hot summer night in 1983 at a quiet house on Cedar Creek Lake, the moment she looked her 5th husband in the eye and decided he would never walk out alive. If you're drawn to stories of justice, betrayal, and the people who reach a point of no return, make sure to subscribe to No Way Out. This is where true crime meets truth. Real cases, real consequences. The darkest corners of human decision, broken down into tiny pieces so you can see every detail and make your own conclusions better. On March 12, 1937, Betty Lou Dunavant was born in Roxborough, North Carolina, to Margaret Louise Smithwick and James Garland Dunavant. Her father worked as a tobacco sharecropper, struggling to make ends meet on their meager farm. The family lived in a shack without window panes, electricity, or running water. Both parents battled alcoholism, creating an unstable home environment for their children. When Betty Lou was 3 years old, she contracted measles. The illness ravaged her small body, leaving her with permanent hearing loss that would affect her speech development. Without access to special education or hearing aids, she learned to read lips to communicate with the world around her. This disability isolated her from other children and made her school years particularly challenging. At age 5, Betty Lou's childhood took an even darker turn. Her father, James Dunavant, sexually abused her several times. According to her accounts, other men close to the family also participated in this abuse. The trauma of these experiences would shape her understanding of relationships and trust for the rest of her life. When Betty Lou was 5, the family moved from North Carolina to Danville, Virginia, seeking better opportunities. Later, they relocated again to Hampton, Virginia, where James found work as a machinist at the Langley Research Center. These frequent moves disrupted any sense of stability Betty Lou might have found. The most devastating blow came when Betty Lou turned 12. Her mother, Margaret, suffered a severe psychotic break and had to be institutionalized. Suddenly, Betty Lou found herself responsible for caring for her younger siblings, Jimmy and Jackie. She was forced to drop out of school in the 10th grade to manage the household while her father worked. Margaret eventually recovered enough to return home, but suffered another breakdown the following year, creating a cycle of instability that defined Betty Lou's adolescence. The responsibility of running a household and caring for children while still a child herself robbed Betty Lou of any normal teenage experience. By age 15, Betty Lou had endured poverty, disability, alleged sexual abuse, family instability, and the burden of premature adult responsibilities. These traumatic experiences created a foundation of pain and dysfunction that would influence every relationship she would form. At just 15 years old in 1952, Betty Lou Donovan married Robert Franklin Branson, desperate to escape her chaotic family situation. Marriage offered what seemed like a path to independence and stability, though she was still legally a child when she took her wedding vows. The following year, in 1953, Betty Lou became a mother for the first time, giving birth to her eldest child. The young teenager now faced the challenges of motherhood while still dealing with her own traumatic past and hearing disability. The responsibilities of caring for an infant while managing a household proved overwhelming for someone who had already been forced to mature too quickly. The marriage quickly became abusive. She claimed that Robert Branson was physically violent with her, establishing what she described as a pattern that would repeat throughout her life. However, these claims of domestic violence would not surface publicly until decades later, long after her conviction and death sentence. After their first year of marriage, Betty Lou and Robert separated due to the alleged abuse. During this separation, Betty Lou attempted suicide, a desperate act that revealed the depth of her emotional pain and instability. Following this suicide attempt, the couple reconciled, suggesting the complex dynamics that would characterize many of Betty Lou's relationships. Over the years, Betty Lou and Robert had 6 children together, with their youngest child Bobby born in 1966. Despite having a large family, Betty Lou longed for the freedoms she felt she had missed as a teenager. She would stay out late into the night at local bars, drinking and flirting, even while saddled with the responsibilities of 6 children. The marriage finally ended for good in 1969, when Robert left Betty Lou permanently. By this time, Betty Lou had displayed behaviors that friends and family found concerning. Her need to escape her domestic responsibilities, combined with her traumatic past, created instabilities that affected her children's upbringing. The divorce left Betty Lou as a single mother of 6 children, struggling financially and emotionally. Her hearing disability made finding steady employment difficult, and she worked various jobs as a cashier and waitress to support her family. The stress of single motherhood, combined with her own unresolved trauma, created a volatile situation. In 1970, Betty Lou married her second husband, Billy York Lane, a union that would establish the violent template for all her future relationships. Betty Lou was now 33 years old, a single mother of 6 children from her first marriage, working various jobs as a cashier and waitress to make ends meet. Billy Lane represented another attempt at finding stability and escape from her difficult circumstances. However, the relationship quickly devolved into the same cycle of conflict that had marked her first marriage, but this time with far more dangerous consequences. The marriage was characterized by heavy drinking and frequent arguments. Billy was physically abusive, though these allegations would not surface until years later. During one particularly violent confrontation, Billy broke Betty Lou's nose. Betty Lou's response to this violence was swift and decisive. Instead of calling police or seeking help through traditional channels, she chose to retaliate with lethal force. She shot Billy York Lane twice in the back of the head with a .38 caliber pistol. The shooting occurred in 1970, and Betty Lou was charged with attempted murder. Billy survived the attack, though he suffered serious injuries that required extensive medical treatment. The case proceeded to trial, where the dynamics of their relationship would be scrutinized. During the trial, A remarkable turn of events occurred that would set a precedent for Betty Lou's future legal troubles. Billy Lane admitted under oath that he had threatened to kill Betty Lou first, effectively providing her with a self-defense argument. This admission led to the attempted murder charges being dropped. In an even more extraordinary development, Betty Lou and Billy remarried after the trial. This reconciliation demonstrated the complex psychological dynamics that characterized Betty Lou's relationships and her ability to manipulate situations to her advantage. However, this second attempt at marriage proved even more unstable than the first, lasting only 1 month before they divorced permanently. The shooting of Billy Lane marked a crucial turning point in Betty Lou's criminal evolution. She had now used deadly force against a husband and walked away without punishment. The incident established a dangerous precedent that violence could be an acceptable solution to marital problems, particularly when framed as self-defense. Betty Lou's third marriage was to Ronnie C. Threlkeld in the mid-1970s. This relationship represented a further escalation in the pattern of violence that was becoming central to Betty Lou's approach to dealing with problematic husbands. The marriage was brief and turbulent, lasting only a few years, and marked by the same cycle of arguments and mutual recriminations. In 1978, Betty Lou's method of dealing with marital conflict took an even more extreme turn. During a confrontation with Ronnie Threlkeld, she attempted to run him over with her automobile. This was not a moment of passion, but a calculated act of attempted murder that demonstrated Betty Lou's willingness to use any weapon at her disposal when relationships became problematic. Ronnie survived this vehicular attack, but the incident clearly showed Betty Lou's escalating willingness to use violence as a solution to personal conflicts. The fact that she was willing to use her car as a weapon indicated that her capacity for violence was not limited to firearms, but extended to any available means of causing harm. The psychological escalation from shooting Billy Lane to attempting vehicular homicide against Ronnie Threlkeld revealed a woman who was becoming increasingly comfortable with violence as a problem-solving mechanism. Each incident built upon the previous one, creating a pattern of escalating aggression that would eventually culminate in successful murder. By the end of the 1970s, Betty Lou had established an unmistakable pattern: quick marriages to financially stable men, escalating domestic conflicts, claims of abuse to justify her actions, violent retaliation that went far beyond self-defense, and dramatic endings that left her free to pursue the next relationship. She had shot one husband and tried to kill another with a vehicle, walking away from both incidents without serious legal consequences. The stage was now set for the truly deadly phase of Betty Lou's criminal career, where her next 2 husbands would not possess the fortune that had allowed Billy Lane and Ronnie Threlkeld to survive their encounters with the woman who would become known as the Texas Black Widow. In late 1979, Betty Lou encountered Doyle Wayne Barker, a man whose quiet life would become tragically entangled with her escalating pattern of violence. Born on August 31, 1939, in Rains County, Texas, Doyle was approaching his 42nd birthday when he became Betty Lou's 4th husband. He represented what appeared to be another opportunity for Betty Lou to find stability and financial security. Doyle owned property on Cedar Creek Lake near Gun Barrel City, Texas, a scenic area about 70 miles southeast of Dallas that attracted retirees, weekend visitors, and those seeking a slower pace of life away from urban pressures. The lake community was known for its fishing, boating, and peaceful atmosphere. His trailer home sat on valuable lakefront property that provided both privacy and scenic beauty. For Betty Lou, who had struggled financially throughout her adult life, Doyle's property ownership represented exactly the kind of security she had been seeking through her marriages. The trailer was a significant asset in an area where lakefront property commanded premium prices. Betty Lou and Doyle's courtship was brief, following her established pattern of quick attachments to men who could provide financial stability. By the end of 1979, they were married, with Betty Lou once again taking on the role of wife while assessing the potential benefits of her new union. However, this fourth marriage proved to be even more volatile and shorter-lived than her previous relationships, lasting only 7 weeks from wedding to separation. The brevity of the marriage suggested that the fundamental incompatibilities and violent tendencies of both parties emerged almost immediately after the ceremony. Both Betty Lou and Doyle engaged in violent behavior toward each other from the beginning of their cohabitation. The relationship was characterized by mutual physical abuse, creating an explosive environment where both parties felt justified in retaliating against the other's violence. Doyle's violent behavior toward Betty Lou was extensive and brutal. He stalked her, physically assaulted her on multiple occasions, and raped her during their brief relationship. The abuse left Betty Lou with visible injuries that would later be documented as part of her narrative of victimization. On the day Doyle left the marriage in early 1981, Betty Lou bore visible evidence of his violence. She had bruises on her face, neck, arms, and chest. Physical proof of the abuse she had endured during their brief time together. These injuries would become part of her justification for the actions she would soon take. Despite the marriage ending quickly, both Betty Lou and Doyle remained on the same property, creating a dangerous situation where two violent individuals continued to interact in close proximity. The property arrangements meant that their separation was not clean, leaving unresolved legal and financial issues that would motivate Betty Lou's later actions. During the autumn of 1981, Betty Lou made disturbing revelations to her daughter Shirley during what should have been a peaceful evening around a campfire. In this intimate family setting, Betty Lou confided her murderous intentions, telling Shirley that she planned to kill Doyle Wayne Barker because she couldn't put up with any more of him beating her, and that she didn't want him around anymore. This conversation revealed that Betty Lou's planning extended beyond claims of self-defense. She also explained the financial motive behind her intentions, telling Shirley that the trailer house was in his name and she was just a co-signer on it, and that if they were to get a divorce, that he would end up with the trailer. The property issue was crucial to understanding Betty Lou's motivation. As a co-signer rather than co-owner, Betty Lou faced the prospect of losing her home and the financial security it represented if Doyle chose to pursue a legal divorce. This financial vulnerability, combined with her claims of ongoing abuse, created what she saw as justification for taking extreme action. In November 1981, Doyle Wayne Barker disappeared under circumstances that initially seemed consistent with the end of their troubled relationship. Betty Lou reported to neighbors and acquaintances that she and Doyle had engaged in a particularly serious fight, after which he had simply left, abandoning his truck and other possessions. This explanation seemed plausible to those who knew about the couple's violent relationship. Neighbors had witnessed their arguments and were aware of the physical abuse occurring in the household. Doyle's apparent decision to leave everything behind and start fresh elsewhere appeared to be a reasonable response to an untenable domestic situation. 3 or 4 days after Doyle's disappearance, Betty Lou had another conversation with her daughter Shirley. With apparent satisfaction, Betty Lou told Shirley that it was all over with and she had done what she intended to do. For nearly 4 years, Doyle's disappearance remained unexplained, but not particularly suspicious to the broader community. The Cedar Creek Lake community accepted Betty Lou's explanation and gradually forgot about Doyle Wayne Barker. No missing person reports were filed, no investigations were launched, and no one suspected that his body lay buried on the very property where he had once lived and loved. Hidden beneath the earth where Betty Lou continued to reside, gardening and maintaining her home as if nothing had happened. In 1982, at a Gun Barrel City bar where Betty Lou worked as a waitress, she encountered Jimmy Don Beets, a Dallas Fire Department captain who would become her 5th and final husband. Born on March 10, 1937, Jimmy Don was the same age as Betty Lou, but their life experiences could not have been more different. Jimmy Don Beets was a classic Texas man, down to earth, hardworking, and respected by everyone who knew him. Standing 5'11" and weighing about 235 pounds, he was a brawny man with thick black hair and arms as big as his grown son's thighs. His physical presence commanded respect, but it was his character that truly defined him among his colleagues and community. After joining the Dallas Fire Department in 1957, Jimmy Don had toiled his way up from first driver to captain through 25 years of dedicated service. He was stationed at Fire Station No. 9 in southeast Dallas, where he earned a reputation as a very responsible individual who had one quality that seemed to rise above a lot of other people: common sense. His fellow firefighters considered themselves his real family, and Chaplain Denny Burris later said, "I think everybody in the department knew Jimmy Don Beets." Jimmy Don's commitment to his job was legendary. One of the few times he ever missed his shift was on Christmas Eve 1957, when his first wife Charlene went into labor. He took her to the hospital, where their son Jamie was born an hour after they arrived. This dedication to duty, while admirable professionally, would strain his family relationships. Jimmy Don's first marriage to Charlene Pullen had been marked by the competing demands of his firefighting career and family life. To Charlene, it seemed like the fire station was his real home, and the other firefighters his real family. He was more true to them than he was to us. The demands of firefighting, with its unpredictable schedules and dangerous work, created stress at home. Tragedy struck the family when, after Jamie's birth, another son was born but lived only 5 hours. A few years later, a daughter was stillborn, leaving Charlene deeply depressed and the marriage under tremendous strain. Unable to cope with the losses and the pressures of being married to a firefighter, Jimmy Don began drinking heavily after work. Over the years, arguments over Jimmy Don's drinking escalated, creating a toxic cycle where work stress led to drinking, which led to marital conflict, which led to more drinking. Eventually, the marriage became unsustainable. One day in 1968, Jimmy Don simply didn't come home. The couple divorced when Jamie was 9 years old, and Jamie took the divorce hard, according to Charlene. For years after his divorce, Jimmy Don had been living the bachelor life on Cedar Creek Lake, about 70 miles southeast of Dallas. The lake area was popular with Dallas residents seeking weekend getaways, retirees, and those wanting a slower pace of life. Jimmy Don owned a 3-bedroom lake house in a subdivision called Glen Oaks, which he had paid off early by doubling up on payments. This property was his own little piece of heaven, the place where he planned to retire. Jimmy Don spent his off-duty hours puttering around his house, helping neighbors with various projects, and indulging in his favorite pastimes of hunting and fishing. His parents had also bought a mobile home in the area when his father retired, making Cedar Creek Lake a family gathering place where Jimmy Don could relax and enjoy the outdoor lifestyle he loved. Cedar Creek Lake was where Jimmy Don met Betty Lou, who was working as a lively waitress and bartender at a local establishment. To Jimmy Don, who had been divorced for several months and was looking toward an early retirement, Betty Lou represented companionship and the possibility of not spending his golden years alone. Betty Lou's sassy charm and vivacious personality immediately attracted Jimmy Don. Betty was fun, she was so cute, she was a sharp dresser, she was a great dancer, and she was really a good time, according to crime writer Irene Pence. After years of living alone, Jimmy Don found Betty Lou's energy and apparent zest for life appealing. Their courtship lasted about 6 months, during which Betty Lou skillfully presented herself as the perfect companion for a firefighter approaching retirement. Jimmy Don thought she was really a lot of fun and a very cute person, and he was clearly smitten with her outgoing personality and apparent devotion to him. On August 19, 1982, Jimmy Don and Betty Lou were married at the courthouse in Kaufman County. Betty Lou Barker became Betty Beets, taking the name she would make infamous. As a retired fire captain, Jimmy Don was already collecting a pension of approximately $1,200 per month. He also had substantial life insurance policies worth over $100,000, including a $43,428.33 accidental death policy and an $86,000 policy through the city of Dallas. Additionally, he would be entitled to increased pension benefits of $790.42 monthly for life once he fully retired. Even before their wedding, Jimmy Don had moved out of his paid-off lake house in Glen Oaks and into Betty Lou's two-bedroom mobile home in Cherokee Shores. Betty Lou had decorated the place with a redwood deck and surrounded it with flowers, creating what appeared to be a cozy love nest for the newlyweds. However, Jimmy Don's son Jamie instantly disliked his father's new bride. There was something about Betty Lou that seemed manipulative and hard to him. When they were alone, with characteristic bluntness, the 24-year-old Jamie told his father exactly what he thought about Betty Lou. Jimmy Don was furious at his son's criticism, declaring, "I love her." This family tension created a rift between father and son that would last until Jimmy Don's death. Jamie's intuitive distrust of Betty Lou proved prophetic, but his father was too enamored with his new wife to heed his son's warnings. Shortly after their wedding, Betty Lou made what seemed like a charming request. She asked Jimmy Don to build a decorative wishing well in their front yard, explaining that she wanted to beautify their property. Jimmy Don, eager to please his new bride, happily complied with her request. Betty Lou's oldest son, Robbie, even helped Jimmy Don dig the hole for the wishing well. Jimmy Don appreciated the gesture and enjoyed working with his stepson on what he thought was a lovely addition to their property. Unknown to Jimmy Don, he was literally digging his own grave. Betty Lou had already decided she was going to kill him for his pension and life insurance money, and she knew exactly how she would dispose of his body using the wishing well he was so willingly constructing. The devoted husband was unknowingly preparing the instrument of his own murder, while believing he was creating something beautiful for his beloved wife. Betty Lou's planning for Jimmy Don's murder was methodical and involved her children as both accomplices and witnesses to her intentions. Her openness about her deadly plans would later provide law enforcement with crucial evidence of premeditation. Betty Lou recruited her son Robbie to help with various aspects of her plan. She confided in him about her intention to kill Jimmy Don, making him an unwilling participant in the conspiracy. The fact that she involved her own child in planning a murder demonstrates the depths of her manipulation and disregard for family bonds. 6 months before Jimmy Don's death, Betty Lou forged his signature on a life insurance application, increasing the potential payout from his murder. This fraudulent act showed that her planning extended well beyond the actual killing to maximizing the financial benefits she would receive. Betty Lou's financial research was thorough. She learned that she would receive $43,428.33 from an accidental death policy, another $86,000 from a policy with the city of Dallas, $15,852.59 from the pension board, and a monthly benefit of $790.42 for the rest of her life, as long as she remained unmarried. Additionally, she planned to sell Jimmy Don's Glastron ski boat for $3,200. Betty Lou also planned to file a claim under a fire insurance policy for damage to Jimmy Don's separate property home. Her comprehensive planning showed that she intended to profit from every possible source connected to Jimmy Don's death. The wishing well that Jimmy Don had built at Betty Lou's request now served its sinister purpose. Betty Lou planned to bury Jimmy Don's body in the decorative well, then plant flowers over it to create the perfect hiding place in plain sight. Betty Lou's plan for staging Jimmy Don's disappearance was elaborate. She intended to place his body in his fishing boat, have Robbie take the boat out into the lake, drop the body into the water, and then set the boat adrift to make it appear that Jimmy Don had accidentally drowned while fishing. When plans changed, Betty Lou adapted her cover story. She scattered Jimmy Don's heart medication in his boat and left his fishing license inside to support the drowning scenario. She understood that investigators would find these items and conclude that Jimmy Don had suffered a medical emergency while fishing. If you're finding this story compelling so far, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to No Way Out. These cases are complex, layered with questions about justice and morality, and we cover them in full detail here. Drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. It really helps us connect with viewers around the world. On the evening of August 6, 1983, Betty Lou put her murderous plan into action. She told her son, Robert "Robbie" Branson II, to leave the house because she intended to kill Jimmy Don Beets that night. At 19 years old, Robbie was forced to become an unwilling participant in his mother's crime. Robbie left the house as instructed and went motorcycle riding for approximately 2 hours. When he returned home, he found Jimmy Don Beets dead from 2 gunshot wounds to the back of the head. The calculated nature of the murder was evident. Betty Lou had shot her husband execution style. Both Jimmy Don and Doyle Wayne Barker had been shot with the same .38 caliber pistol, the same type of weapon Betty Lou had used to shoot her second husband Billy Lane years earlier. The consistency in her weapon choice showed this was not a crime of passion, but a methodical execution. Robbie helped his mother wrap Jimmy Don's body in a sleeping bag and bury it in the wishing well that Jimmy Don had built in their front yard just months earlier. After burying the body, Betty Lou telephoned the police to report Jimmy Don missing, beginning the cover-up phase of her plan. Her performance as a worried wife, concerned about her missing husband, was convincing enough to launch a genuine search effort. The next day, Betty Lou and Robbie implemented the boat staging portion of their plan. They scattered Jimmy Don's heart medication, glasses, and fishing license around his boat, then removed the propeller and set the boat adrift in Cedar Creek Lake. On August 12, 1983, Jimmy Don's boat was found washed ashore near the Redwood Beach Marina. The discovery of the empty boat with Jimmy Don's personal effects inside convinced authorities that he had likely fallen overboard and drowned. Believing that Jimmy Don had accidentally drowned, police spent 3 weeks dragging Cedar Creek Lake searching for his body. Meanwhile, Betty Lou tended to her front yard garden, literally standing over her victim's grave, while search and rescue teams combed the lake. After the boat was found, Betty Lou packed the wishing well with peat moss and planted flowers over Jimmy Don's buried remains. She had created the perfect memorial garden that allowed her to hide the evidence of her crime in plain sight. The 3-week search of Cedar Creek Lake yielded no results, as investigators dragged the water looking for Jimmy Don's body. All the while, his remains lay buried, just yards from where the search teams parked their vehicles and equipment. Betty Lou maintained her garden throughout this period, regularly tending to the flowers she had planted over Jimmy Don's grave in the wishing well. Neighbors and investigators alike admired her dedication to beautifying her property during such a difficult time. Approximately 3 months after the murder, Robbie confided the truth about Jimmy Don's death to his common-law wife, because it was just bugging him. However, he waited 2 full years to contact authorities because he said he was protecting his mother. In March 1985, Betty Lou's attorney E. Ray Andrews persuaded a Henderson County judge to sign an order declaring Jimmy Don Beets legally dead and naming Betty Lou as administrator of his estate. This legal maneuver was crucial for collecting insurance benefits and accessing Jimmy Don's financial assets. Andrews was also working to collect fire insurance benefits on Jimmy Don's house for Betty Lou, though the insurance company was hesitant due to an ongoing arson investigation. The house had mysteriously burned down after Betty Lou failed in her attempts to sell it, and she had forged Jimmy Don's name to deed documents. Andrews retained a Dallas law firm to petition the Dallas Fire and Police Pension Board to pay Betty Lou a widow's pension of about $790 monthly, plus Jimmy Don's back pay and life insurance benefits totaling approximately $180,000. The pension board was scheduled to meet on June 13, 1985, to approve the claim. For nearly 2 years, Betty Lou's plan worked perfectly. She had committed the perfect murder, staged a convincing accident, and was on the verge of collecting substantial financial benefits from Jimmy Don's death. Law enforcement had closed the case, and no one suspected that Cedar Creek Lake's most dedicated gardener was tending flowers that grew from the grave of her murdered husband. In 1985, the Henderson County Sheriff's Department received anonymous information that would crack open the cold case of Jimmy Don Beets' disappearance. The tip provided enough evidence for authorities to obtain a search warrant for Betty Lou's property near Cedar Creek Lake. After nearly 2 years of believing that Jimmy Don had drowned in a fishing accident, investigators were about to uncover a much more shocking truth. When police executed the search warrant on June 8, 1985, they made a grisly discovery in Betty Lou's well-maintained front yard. Digging up the decorative wishing well revealed Jimmy Don Beets' remains, wrapped in a sleeping bag exactly as Robbie had described. But the discovery didn't end there. Continuing their search of the property, investigators found a second body buried under a storage shed. This victim was identified as Doyle Wayne Barker, Betty Lou's fourth husband, who had disappeared in 1981. Forensic examination revealed that both men had been shot with the same .38 caliber pistol. Jimmy Don had suffered 2 gunshot wounds, while Doyle had been shot 3 times. The ballistic evidence linked both murders to the same weapon and likely the same killer. Betty Lou was arrested on June 8, 1985, and charged with capital murder in Jimmy Don's death. Despite the discovery of Doyle's body, she was never formally charged with his murder, since the prosecution decided to focus on the case where they could seek the death penalty. Betty Lou's own children became the key witnesses against her, providing prosecutors with detailed accounts of her confessions and their forced participation in covering up the murders. Their testimony would prove crucial in establishing both premeditation and Betty Lou's guilt. Robert Robbie Branson II, who was 19 at the time of Jimmy Don's murder, provided the most damaging testimony. He told investigators that on the night of August 5, 1983, his mother told him she was going to kill him, referring to Jimmy Don. "I was kind of shocked," Robbie testified, "but I suspected my mother would carry out her threat because she told him she didn't want him at their trailer home that evening." Robbie's testimony described how he went motorcycle riding for about 2 hours and returned to find Jimmy Don dead. "I helped her take the body and place it in the wishing well," he admitted to the court. His account provided prosecutors with a detailed timeline of the murder and cover-up. Betty Lou's daughter Shirley Stegner, who was 26 at the time of her testimony, provided equally damaging evidence. She testified that Betty Lou had confided her intent to shoot Jimmy Don and set his boat adrift 1 week before his disappearance, and had confirmed the fact of the murder in subsequent conversations. During a telephone conversation after Jimmy Don's disappearance, Shirley asked her mother if she had done what we had talked about before, which related to their previous conversation about killing Jimmy Don and staging a boating accident. Betty Lou responded simply, "Yes." Shirley testified that several weeks later she returned to her mother's residence when Betty Lou informed her that her and my brother Robbie had buried Jimmy Don Beets in the wishing well. This testimony established that Betty Lou had freely admitted to both the murder and the location of the body. Regarding Doyle Wayne Barker's murder, Shirley provided testimony about conversations with her mother in October 1981. Betty Lou had told her while sitting around a campfire that she was going to kill Doyle Wayne Barker because she couldn't put up with any more of him beating her, and that she didn't want him around anymore. Shirley also testified that she had assisted her mother in burying Doyle's body in October 1981, after Betty Lou had shot and killed him. Her testimony linked Betty Lou directly to both murders and established a pattern of involving her children in the cover-ups. The emotional toll on the children was evident in Robbie's testimony about why he initially remained silent. "Because I was protecting my mother." Both children were initially charged with capital murder along with their mother, But charges were dropped when they agreed to testify against Betty Lou. Their willingness to testify against their own mother demonstrated the strength of the prosecution's case and the horror of what Betty Lou had forced them to witness and participate in. Betty Lou's lead defense attorney was E. Ray Andrews, a country practitioner whose career would later crash spectacularly. Betty Lou's trial for the murder of Jimmy Don Beets began on July 11, 1985, in the 173rd District Court of Henderson County, Texas. The case attracted significant media attention both locally and nationally, focusing public interest on the small East Texas community. The prosecution's case relied entirely on circumstantial evidence, as there were no eyewitnesses to the actual killing. However, both Robbie Branson and Shirley Stegner had testified that Betty Lou voiced her intent to kill Jimmy Don before the incident and admitted to the act afterward. The trial court instructed the jury that Robbie was, as a matter of law, an accomplice witness to Jimmy Don's killing. The court further instructed that the jury could not convict Betty Lou based solely on Robbie's testimony unless they believed his testimony was corroborated by other evidence connecting her to the offense. Jerry Hast, administrator of the Dallas Police and Fire Pension Fund, testified that an application for benefits had been filed on Betty Lou's behalf and that the pension board had voted to approve a settlement. The settlement was scheduled to be finalized on June 10, 1985, but was canceled after board members learned that Betty Lou had been arrested for murdering Jimmy Don. On October 11, 1985, the jury found Betty Lou guilty of the capital offense of murder for remuneration. The guilty verdict came after jurors spent considerable time deliberating the evidence against her. One juror, V.J. Lamons of Brownsboro, expressed the certainty of the verdict afterward. "She's as guilty as sin." Juror Ray Rogers of Athens said the panel was originally deadlocked 10-2 for conviction, but the two holdouts changed their minds after further deliberation. During the separate penalty phase on October 14, 1985, the trial court sentenced Betty Lou to death by lethal injection. Betty Lou burst into tears when the death sentence was pronounced, but regained her composure as deputies escorted her from the courtroom. As she left the Henderson County Courthouse, Betty Lou told television cameramen, "I'm still not guilty," maintaining her innocence despite the overwhelming evidence presented against her. Betty Lou became the third woman in Texas facing a death sentence at that time, joining the rare group of women condemned to execution in the United States. Betty Lou became Texas Department of Criminal Justice Death Row number 810, received by the Texas Department of Corrections on October 14, 1985, and incarcerated in the Mountain View Unit, now Patrick O'Daniel Unit. An automatic appeal to the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals initially overturned Betty Lou's conviction, with the court ruling that insurance and pension benefits were not the same as remuneration under Texas law. However, the state requested a rehearing, and on September 21, 1988, the Court of Criminal Appeals reversed its decision and ruled that the conviction and sentence should stand. The Court of Criminal Appeals held that a person commits a murder for remuneration where the actor kills a victim in order to receive a benefit or financial settlement paid upon the death of the victim, such as proceeds of insurance and retirement benefits, as in the present case. This ruling established important precedent for future capital murder cases in Texas. The Supreme Court of the United States denied a writ of certiorari on June 26, 1989, and Betty Lou's first execution date was set for November 8, 1989. On November 1st, she received a stay from the trial court after filing a state habeas petition. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals denied her habeas petition on June 27, 1990, leading to a second execution date of December 6, 1990. However, a federal petition for writ of habeas corpus was filed 3 days before her scheduled execution, and the federal district court granted a stay of execution on December 4th. The case was sent to federal district court, which on September 2, 1998, denied Betty Lou's habeas corpus relief. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals affirmed this decision, ruling that Betty Lou was placed on notice by Texas Penal Code that murdering her husband for insurance proceeds and pension benefits constituted a capital offense. After her appeals were denied throughout 1999, a final execution date was set for February 24, 2000. Betty Lou had exhausted all legal remedies available to her after more than 14 years on death row. At the time of her execution, Betty Lou was 62 years old and had 5 children, 9 grandchildren, and 6 great-grandchildren. Despite the passage of 15 years, her family remained divided about her guilt and the appropriateness of her death sentence. In the years leading up to her execution, domestic violence advocates and human rights groups rallied to Betty Lou's cause, arguing that she had been severely abused by her father and all 5 of her husbands. Her daughters displayed pictures of Betty Lou showing bruises and injuries to the state parole board, claiming she had been severely beaten by all her husbands. Sister Helen Prejean, the death penalty opponent made famous by the movie Dead Man Walking, became involved in Betty Lou's case. Prejean said she was appalled by the case, stating on ABC's Good Morning America, "Jurors didn't know they were dealing with a battered woman who had been abused since she was 5. In a 1999 statement, as her execution approached, Betty Lou said, "My time is running out, and the state of Texas will pick up where my husband left off. While the Texas law enforcement out there did nothing to help me, it is now legal for them to finish the job." However, not everyone was sympathetic to Betty Lou's plight. One juror from her original trial, Connie Harrington, wrote, "She continues to be a threat to society." In the weeks leading up to her scheduled February 24, 2000 execution, Betty Lou's supporters made desperate final appeals to Texas Governor George W. Bush and the State Board of Pardons and Paroles. Her clemency petition was under review in the nation's leading execution state, where 206 prisoners had been put to death since 1982. One of Betty Lou's daughter, Faye Lane, made a tearful plea to spare her mother's life, saying, "I wish to God the jury had heard the truth about my mother." Her daughters presented photographs of Betty Lou showing bruises and injuries to support their claims that she had been severely beaten by all her husbands. On February 23, 2000, a federal judge denied Betty Lou's final motion for a stay of execution. Her lawyers had claimed she had been denied civil rights because she hadn't been permitted to testify at her trial about being abused by her husbands. U.S. District Judge James Nowlin showed little sympathy, calling the motion yet another example of a prisoner attempting to delay execution just prior to the execution date. About an hour before the scheduled execution, the U.S. Supreme Court declined to intervene in the case, refusing to grant a final stay. Minutes later, Governor George W. Bush declined to grant clemency, allowing the execution to proceed as scheduled. The failure of these final appeals meant that Betty Lou would become only the 4th woman executed in the United States since the Supreme Court allowed capital punishment to resume in 1976. She would also be the 2nd woman executed in Texas since the Civil War, following Carla Faye Tucker, who was executed on February 3, 1998. On February 24, 2000, at 6:18 p.m. CST, Betty Lou Beets was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas. She declined to request a final meal and made no final statement before her execution. When given the opportunity to make final words before the lethal injection was administered, Betty Lou again chose silence. This moment represents the condemned person's last chance to speak to the world, to their victims' families, to their own loved ones, or to history itself. Betty Lou spent her final morning meeting with relatives who had come to say goodbye. However, no Beets family members were present at her execution, showing the deep divisions the case had created even within families affected by her crimes. Jimmy Don Beets' son Jamie witnessed his stepmother's execution and later spoke to CBS early show anchor Julie Chen about the experience. He said Betty Lou really didn't have no expression on her face at all, and didn't appear remorseful or frightened as she was strapped to the gurney. I just kind of focused on my dad. I seen my dad's face. I knew that he was smiling and it was over now, Jamie Beets said. He believed his father would have wanted the execution. I think my dad would want this just to be over for me and the family. Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story on No Way Out.